October 6th, 2026, 9:14 local time. The Taiwan Strait, 74 nautical miles southwest of the port of Kaohsiung on Taiwan's southern coast, and 88 nautical miles northeast of the Chinese port of Xiamen. The strait here is 180 kilometers wide. The sky is clear. The sea state too, a 1.4-meter swell from the northeast with wind at 11 knots. Surface visibility is unlimited. A perfect autumn morning in one of the most contested stretches of water on Earth. A Gerald R. Ford-class nuclear-powered aircraft carrier is transiting southeast at 18 knots, conducting a freedom of navigation passage through the Taiwan Strait. The fourth such transit by a U.S. carrier in 2026, each one a deliberate strategic signal in response to an escalating pattern of PLA military activity around Taiwan that began in August and has not meaningfully de-escalated since. The carrier's air wing has had aircraft airborne continuously since 0600. 2 FA-18E Super Hornets on combat air patrol north of the formation. 1 E-2D Hawkeye on early warning station at 24,000 feet. And 1 MH-60R helicopter on anti-submarine warfare patrol in the forward sector. The strike group's anti-submarine warfare screen is, by any reasonable measure, robust. A Virginia-class fast attack submarine running submerged 18 nautical miles ahead. 2 Arleigh Burke. Flight 3 destroyers with SQS-53C hull-mounted sonars in active mode. 1 destroyer towing a TB-29A thin-line towed array behind it on the formation's port side. The MH-60R ahead with dipping sonar. A P-8A Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft on a 4-hour station orbit 40 miles to the west, dropping sonobuoys on a systematic barrier pattern across the formation's projected track. It is, in every formal sense, a well-defended formation. The anti-submarine warfare architecture represents decades of investment, doctrine, and operational experience. It is optimized, thoroughly and professionally, against one specific threat: a submarine. What is approaching the carrier at 9:14 is not a submarine. Welcome. I'm your host, Navy Legends. Tonight we are examining the most underreported and least understood dimension of the emerging PLA undersea warfare capability. Not the Type 093, not the Type 095, not any manned submarine at all, but the unmanned underwater vehicle, the UUV, operating autonomously at depths and on timelines that have no precedent in naval warfare. China's investment in autonomous undersea systems has been documented in open source reporting since 2019. The specific capability we are examining tonight: a large displacement autonomous underwater vehicle carrying a heavyweight torpedo payload, pre-positioned on the seafloor, activated by a remote command, and executing its attack profile without a human operator in the loop, is an extrapolation from confirmed PLA development programs. That is, by the assessment of multiple Western naval analysts. Not merely plausible, but likely already fielded in experimental form. This is a fictional simulation. Every physics calculation is grounded in documented performance parameters. Let's begin. The Taiwan Strait at the position of our engagement has an average depth of 60 meters, dropping to 80 meters in the central channel. The bottom is sandy silt with intermittent rocky outcroppings. A relatively featureless seabed compared to the complex topology of the Yellow Sea or the South China Sea's island chains. In those 60 to 80 meters of water, a large autonomous underwater vehicle resting on the bottom is acoustically indistinguishable from a rock formation, a sediment mound, or any of the hundreds of other acoustic returns that clutter the shallow water sonar picture. The PLA designation for the system involved in this engagement is not publicly known. Western intelligence assessments, working from satellite imagery of development facilities and acoustic signatures logged by SSN patrols, have assigned the system the working designation LUUV-H. Large unmanned underwater vehicle. Heavy. The system is assessed as displacing 8 to 12 tons, with electric propulsion capable of 6 to 8 knots sustained, a maximum depth of 200 meters. Autonomous navigation incorporating terrain, following sonar and inertial guidance, and a payload section carrying 2 heavyweight torpedo bodies. either the standard U6 or a newly assessed derivative, the U9, believed to incorporate an improved wake-homing terminal guidance package. Once deployed, the LUUV-H navigates autonomously to a pre-programmed waiting position on the seabed and shuts down all active systems. In this dormant state, it generates no propulsion noise, no active sonar emissions, and minimal electrical signature. Its thermal profile becomes indistinguishable from ambient sediment temperature after approximately 4 hours of dormancy. The LUUV-H, deployed in the Taiwan Strait Central Channel, had been on the bottom for 31 days. It had been positioned on September 5th, 31 days before the carrier transit, by a planned Type 022 missile boat operating under commercial cover as a survey vessel. The positioning was logged by no U.S. or Allied intelligence asset. The Taiwan Strait carries more commercial vessel traffic per square nautical mile than almost any waterway on Earth. A survey vessel deploying equipment in a 90-minute window generates no detectable anomaly in that traffic pattern. The LUUV-H's activation trigger was a compressed encrypted command burst on an extremely low-frequency channel, transmitted at 8:47, 27 minutes before our timestamp. The command encoded the carrier's current position, course, and speed, derived from a planned satellite overpass at 0831. It also encoded the engagement authorization and attack profile. Activate from dormancy, navigate to the computed intercept point, and execute a torpedo attack on the carrier's keel. At 8:47, the LUUV-H, 4.2 nautical miles ahead of the carrier's projected track and 3.1 nautical miles to the east of the formation's center line, received the activation command and initiated its startup sequence. Electric motors powered up to minimum turns. Navigation systems aligned against its stored inertial reference. Propulsion began at 3 knots, the minimum speed at which the vehicle could maintain directional control while generating the absolute minimum acoustic output. At 3 knots, 4.2 nautical miles represented 84 minutes of transit to the intercept point. The carrier was closing at 18 knots. The geometry required the LUUV-H to move to a position approximately 1.8 nautical miles ahead of the carrier's track and wait. Not on the bottom this time, but hovering at 45 meters depth. Engines at absolute minimum turns, waiting for the carrier to pass overhead. The P-8A Poseidon sonobuoy barrier was the first detection opportunity. The barrier pattern had been established on a north-south line 22 miles ahead of the formation, with sonobuoys spaced at 4 nautical mile intervals on an east-west axis. The LUUV-H's transit path at 3 knots, on a heading designed to approach the intercept point from the northeast, passed through the barrier's eastern edge, through a gap between sonobuoy positions 5 and 6 of the barrier pattern. The gap existed because the barrier had been designed to detect submarine speed contacts, vessels traveling at 6 to 20 knots on direct approach headings. The LUUV-H 3-knot profile, approaching at an oblique angle, generated a narrowband acoustic line in the frequency range associated with small electric motors. Sonobuoy 5 detected a faint narrowband contact at 0906 and transmitted the data to the P-8A's acoustic processor. The processor evaluated the contact against its classification library and flagged it as a possible contact. Confidence level 34%, consistent with either a small autonomous vehicle or biological noise from schooling fish. The P-8A crew requested a second sonobuoy drop to refine the classification. The second sonobuoy entered the water at 0909 and established contact at 0911 with a bearing line that cross-fixed the contact's position to within 600 meters. The acoustic processor updated its confidence level to 61%. Probable mechanical contact, bearing characteristics inconsistent with biological source. The P-8A mission commander transmitted a contact report to the formation at 091244. The formation's anti-submarine warfare coordinator, aboard the lead destroyer, received the contact report at 091251. He immediately classified it as a subsurface contact requiring investigation and began vectoring the MH-60R helicopter toward the contact position. The MH-60R was 11.4 nautical miles from the contact position, traveling at 130 knots. Time to arrive and dip sonar. approximately 5 minutes and 40 seconds. The carrier was 3.8 nautical miles from the LUUV-H's waiting position when the contact report was transmitted. At 18 knots, 3.8 nautical miles represented 12 minutes and 40 seconds before the carrier would pass over the LUUV-H. The MH-60R would arrive 5 minutes and 40 seconds before the carrier reached the LUUV-H position. The geometry was survivable if the helicopter could classify and engage the contact before the carrier arrived at the intercept point. The LUUV-H's onboard autonomous engagement system had processed the acoustic environment since activation. Its passive sonar array had been tracking the carrier's propulsion signature for 19 minutes. At 9:13:04, 10 seconds after the formation transmitted the contact report, but 16 seconds before the carrier's ASW coordinator had formulated a response. The LUUV-H's engagement logic evaluated the approaching carrier's range and bearing, computed the optimal torpedo release point, and determined that the carrier's approach geometry had reached the outer boundary of the engagement envelope. The autonomous system did not wait for a human authorization. It had been pre-authorized. Its decision parameters had been encoded in the activation command. The engagement logic was executing exactly as programmed. At 9:13:22, the LUUV-H launched both torpedoes. Two U-9 heavyweight torpedoes left the LUUV-H's forward launch tubes, running on electric propulsion in low noise mode at 35 knots, approaching the carrier's projected track on a course that would bring them to the keel intercept point in approximately 3 minutes and 40 seconds. The carrier's SQS-53C hull-mounted sonar detected the torpedo launch transients at 09:13:31, 9 seconds after launch. The sonar supervisor's call went out immediately. Torpedo in the water. 2 units. Bearing 174. Close aboard. This is not a drill. In the Combat Information Center, the Tactical Action Officer processed the call in 2.1 seconds and ordered all ahead flank and immediate torpedo countermeasure deployment. The AN/SLQ-25 Nixie was already deployed. Standard posture for Taiwan Strait transits. The torpedo countermeasure launchers fired 6 AN/SLQ-39 acoustic bubble targets in rapid succession. At 18 knots, the carrier could accelerate to 30 knots in approximately 70 seconds. In those 70 seconds, the U-9 torpedoes were covering the distance to the intercept point at 35 knots, 18 meters per second. At launch range of approximately 1,800 meters, the time to intercept at constant geometry was 51.4 seconds. The carrier had 51.4 seconds, with a 70-second acceleration curve to maximum speed. The physics were not favorable. The U-9's wake-homing terminal guidance had been activated from the moment of launch. Unlike earlier wake-homing designs, the U-9's guidance system incorporated an initial transit phase on pre-programmed bearing and range data before transitioning to active wake-homing, a design that made the weapon resistant to the AN/SLQ-39 bubble targets in the transit phase, since the weapon was not yet searching for a wake signature. It would transition to wake-homing at a range of 400 meters from the projected intercept point. At 9:13:44, 22 seconds after launch, the MH-60R arrived on scene over the LUUV-H position and dipped its sonar. The contact was immediate and strong. The LUUV-H, having expended its torpedoes, was now running its motors at higher power to clear the area, generating a clear acoustic signature at 42 meters depth directly below the helicopter. The MH-60R crew immediately dropped a Mark 54 lightweight torpedo. The Mark 54 acquired the LUUV-H at 09:14:11 and detonated against its hull at 09:14:18. 56 seconds after the torpedoes had been launched, the LUUV-H was destroyed. The U-9 torpedoes were already 37 seconds into their run. Destroying their carrier vehicle had no effect on their guidance or propulsion. They were autonomous from the moment of launch. The carrier's hard turn to starboard, initiated at 09:13:33, 11 seconds after the torpedo launch call, had begun to displace the ship's track from the U-9's projected intercept point. A 332-meter ship turning at maximum rudder angle generates a wake disruption that extends 200 to 400 meters laterally from the original track. The U-9's transit phase guidance was tracking a projected intercept point based on the carrier's course and speed at the moment of torpedo launch. The turn was moving the actual intercept point away from the projected one. The first U-9 transitioned to wake homing mode at 091414 at a range of 400 meters from the projected intercept point, which was now 180 meters lateral to the carrier's actual wake. The seeker swept. It detected the carrier's wake boundary at 9:14:17 and turned to follow it. A 332-meter nuclear-powered aircraft carrier at 22 knots and accelerating leaves a turbulent wake column 40 to 60 meters wide that is detectable to a wake homing seeker for several minutes after the ship has passed. The U-9 had locked onto this signature and was tracking up the wake column toward the carrier's stern. The AN/SLQ-39 bubble targets had been deployed at 091335. They generate an acoustic signature and a minor water turbulence. In the U-9's pre-transition guidance phase, they had no effect. In the wake homing phase, the bubble targets created a partial disruption in the wake boundary signature that caused the U-9 seeker to lose and reacquire the wake track twice in a 4-second window, between 091419 and 091423. Each reacquisition introduced a 0.3-second delay. The cumulative delay of 0.6 seconds shifted the first U-9's impact point from the carrier's keel at frame 180, directly beneath the central machinery spaces, to the keel at frame 211, approximately 40 meters aft of the original aim point. The first U-9 detonated beneath the carrier's keel at frame 211 at 091431. The warhead, a 300-kilogram shaped charge and fragmentation body, detonated at 6 meters depth directly beneath the hull. The explosion created an upward-directed pressure pulse and gas bubble that struck the keel with a force that structural engineers would later describe as equivalent to a localized seismic event. The keel at frame 211, a 60mm HY100 steel section, fractured over a 3.2-meter span. 3 adjacent transverse frames cracked. The hull plating in the affected section deflected inward by 14 centimeters before the elastic limit of the remaining structure absorbed the deformation. Flooding began through the fractured keel section at a rate of approximately 800 liters per minute. Serious, but not catastrophic. The compartment isolation valves sealing the adjacent spaces within 4 seconds of the breach. The ship's list remained under 1 degree. The nuclear propulsion plant, protected by its own shock-isolated mounting system and located 60 meters forward of the impact point, registered the event on its vibration sensors and automatically reduced power as a protective measure, dropping the carrier's speed to 14 knots before the engineers manually restored the power reduction. 14 sailors in the keel area and adjacent compartments sustained injuries from the shock loading. Concussions, lacerations, 2 fractured wrists, 1 dislocated hip from a sailor thrown against a machinery mounting. None were life-threatening. All were treated aboard ship. The second U-9 arrived 3.2 seconds after the first, tracking the same wake column, impacting at frame 218, 7 meters aft of the first impact. The second detonation, in a keel section already structurally compromised by the first, produced a combined breach area of approximately 1.4 square meters and cracked 2 additional transverse frames. The flooding rate through the combined breach increased to approximately 1,900 liters per minute, still within the damage control capability of the ship's pumping systems if the breach could be approached for shoring, which the flooding rate made extremely difficult in the immediate term. The carrier was damaged. It was not in danger of sinking. Its nuclear propulsion gave it effectively unlimited power for pumping operations. Its below-deck compartmentalization, the multiple watertight subdivisions of a Ford-class carrier's hull, provided enormous reserve buoyancy. But it was slowing, listing 2.4 degrees to port as flooding asymmetry developed in the keel area, and it would require immediate escort to a repair facility. The tactical response unfolded in parallel with the damage control effort. The Virginia-class submarine, operating 18 nautical miles ahead, reversed course at maximum speed upon receiving the torpedo warning. It was 22 nautical miles from the LUUV-H's last known position and closing at 25 knots. But the Mark 54 had already destroyed the vehicle. There was nothing to find. The P-8A expanded its sonobuoy pattern to search for additional co-deployed units across a 30 nautical mile area, dropping 34 sonobuoys over 4 hours. No further contacts were detected. The strike authorization request reached Pacific Fleet Command at 0919, 5 minutes and 38 seconds after the first torpedo impact. The request covered one specific target, the Plan Type 022 survey vessel, now identified through cross-referencing the vessel's transit history with the LUUV-H deployment geometry that had positioned the vehicle on September 5th. The vessel was currently in port at Xiamen Naval Base, 88 nautical miles to the west. A strike on a vessel in a Chinese naval base was an escalation step that the National Security Council would need to authorize. The request was transmitted to the NSC Situation Room at 9:22. The NSC convened an emergency session at 9:45 Washington time. The deliberation lasted 38 minutes. No strike was authorized. The political assessment held that a kinetic strike on a Chinese naval installation in response to an attack by an autonomous system whose attribution, while highly confident, could not be made publicly irrefutable within the required time frame. Crossed a threshold the administration was not prepared to cross without clearer Allied consensus. The carrier was escorted by both destroyers to the U.S. naval facility at Guam, arriving 71 hours after the engagement. The dry dock assessment confirmed the structural keel damage and determined 60 to 90 days of repair before resuming full flight operations. The official U.S. government statement, released 6 hours after the engagement, characterized the attack as an unprovoked act of aggression against a vessel conducting a lawful freedom of navigation transit and demanded an immediate explanation from Beijing. Beijing's response, released 9 hours later, denied involvement and characterized the incident as a consequence of U.S. provocative military activities in China's claimed waters. A statement delivered with the complete composure of a government that had prepared its communications in advance. The UN Security Council convened an emergency session. China vetoed the proposed resolution. The session concluded without outcome. The intelligence investigation took 14 days to produce preliminary findings. 3 key conclusions emerged. First, the LUUV-H had rested on the seafloor for 31 days without detection by any U.S. or Allied surveillance asset in the Taiwan Strait, confirming that PLA pre-positioning doctrine for autonomous undersea systems was operationally mature. Second, the 9-second detection window between torpedo launch and sonar contact and the resulting 51-second engagement geometry established that the LUUV-H attack profile was specifically engineered to exploit the minimum detection range of hull-mounted sonar in Taiwan Strait shallow water acoustics. The geometry was calculated, not accidental. Third, the P-8A contact report at 09/12:44, 38 seconds before the torpedoes launched, was the decisive near miss of the engagement. A sonobuoy barrier spaced at 3 nautical miles rather than 4 would have reached prosecution confidence threshold 4 minutes earlier, altering the carrier's track before the LUUV-H reached its firing position, 4 nautical miles versus 3 nautical miles. That gap, a resource allocation decision made during the mission planning phase based on available sonobuoy inventory and standard barrier doctrine, was the difference between a carrier that turned away from the threat before the engagement began and a carrier that spent 90 days in dry dock. This is what Navy Legends returns to with every scenario that pushes the boundary of what we understand about the evolving threat environment. The decisions that determine the outcome of a future engagement are not made in the seconds of the engagement itself. They are made weeks earlier, in the sonobuoy allocation table of a P-8A mission plan. They are made years earlier, in the specification document for the sonar processing algorithm that classifies a 3-knot electric motor contact at 34% confidence instead of 71%. They are made decades earlier in the investment decisions that determine whether the U.S. Navy fields a counter-UUV detection system. before or after the first carrier is damaged by one. The Taiwan Strait on October 6th was not the opening of a war. It was a demonstration, precisely calibrated, expertly executed, and deliberately structured to remain below the threshold that would trigger the kinetic response China was not prepared to absorb. The LUUV-H on the seafloor for 31 days. The pre-positioned torpedoes. The autonomous engagement logic that removed the human decision point and replaced it with a mathematical threshold. None of these required a sailor in a submarine. None of them generated a radar return. None of them could have been intercepted by an SM-6, an SM-3, a phalanx, or a ram. The threat that does not announce itself is always the most dangerous one. Stay informed. Stay vigilant. I'll see you in the next one.